Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Amy and I'm the local history officer here at the Gympie Regional Libraries, and I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to our presentation on Bushrangers today. Today we'll take an exciting look at some of the most notorious bushrangers that lived and worked in the Gympie region. Firstly, we'll learn about some of our local bushrangers, the outlaws that lived and worked in Gympie and the surrounding areas. This first true story is about a bushranger by the name of William Troden, who went by the nickname Podgy. This story truly encapsulates the meaning of the saying, "Looks can be deceiving and you will see why." This story I'm about to share with you is about Podgy and his accomplice, Joseph Blake, and this story has been taken from the Moreton Bay and More blog online. It is about a highway robbery orchestrated by Podgy and another bushranger by the name of Joseph Blake. So at 4 p.m. on the 30th of July, 1868, 4 men were on the road to the new gold rush at Yabba, which is near Imbil. The 4 men were Henry Redman, Robert Crothers, John Crothers, and Thomas Gill. They were about 6 kilometres from Imbil when Podgy and Blake rode up on horseback and approached the 4 gentlemen. Both Podgy and Blake were armed, and they yelled, "Bail up or we'll blow your brains out." The 4 men did as they were told because Podgy had a double-barreled gun aimed right at them. Podgy was the stouter and more rugged of the 2 men. He wore a scarf around the lower part of his face, hoping not to be recognised. However, unfortunately for Podgy, his facial features were recognised in this robbery by one of the 4 gentlemen named Mr. Edwin Redman. Now, Joseph Blake was the younger of the 2, and he wore a black handkerchief over his entire face with the eye holes cut out. Joseph was said to be the more temperate of the 2 bushrangers. However, he was still very desperate to score some fine goods from some other, more worldly gentlemen. Now, Podgy and Blake cornered the men and forced them into some nearby bushes on the side of the road so that nobody could hear or see the robbery taking place. That day, they robbed the 4 gentlemen of £10 and 30 shillings. Following this, they tied the travellers to some nearby saplings. After this, the 4 gentlemen were threatened that their brains would be blown out again in much more crude language if they ever spoke of the incident or were caught trying to escape. Now, remember how I told you earlier about Edwin Redman and how he recognised Podgy? Well, Edwin Redman waited for just the right moment to exact his revenge. He and the other men waited until Podgy and Blake were about 16 kilometres away before attempting to escape. Because they were just tied to saplings, one of the men was able to get his hand free and started untying the others. They went straight into the Imbil township and reported the robbery to a local police officer. Edwin described Podgy in great detail. He could recall his face, hat, clothes, and gun. He could even remember the brand that was on Podgy and Blake's horses. Talk about a great memory. Now, local police officer Dennis McCarthy interviewed Imbil residents and station owners, checking to see if anyone recognised the branding of the horses. Due to the detailed description given to him, Dennis had a fairly good idea that it was Podgy and Joseph Blake who committed the crime. 1 week later, having fled from the Imbil area, Podgy was arrested at the Kilcoy police station on suspicion of committing the crime near Imbil. When the Kilcoy officers told him that he was under suspicion of committing such a crime, Podgy said, and I quote, "I am as innocent as God and his angels." He even denied the crime, despite owning the horse with the same brand that Edwin Redman had described to police officers. Now, what of Joseph Blake, I hear you ask? Well, Joseph, he was a bit more cunning, and hence a bit hard to find. It was 3 weeks later that he was arrested near the Dividing Range. He was arrested due to the fact that he was in possession of a gun and some clothing that belonged to the 4 gentlemen back in Imbil. The police officers were able to track his horse, which was missing a horseshoe. This is what led to his arrest. They say that Joseph Blake took the arrest quite well and thought that it was all okay, seeming as though he was only under suspicion of being guilty and not yet proven guilty. And it was on Friday the 28th of August 1868 that both Podgy and Blake were summoned to the Gympie courthouse to face their robbery charges. The Gympie townsfolk were very excited to catch a glimpse of the two notorious bushrangers Podgy and Blake. It is said that most of the town turned up to watch their trial. In the courthouse, both Podgy and Blake were first convicted of another crime, a robbery in Maryborough on the 26th of September 1868. The witnesses of this earlier crime in Maryborough gave a very detailed evidence and description of Podgy and Blake and identified these men as the two robbers. Their branded horses were also tied up outside the courthouse, which made it even easier to link these men to the crimes. Now, Podgy and Blake had many alibis and denied any involvement in such crimes. When witnesses identified the men in court, they said, "I've never seen that gentleman before." And their lies nearly worked except for the fact that their alibi witnesses were conveniently unavailable or had gone missing on the day of the court trial. Now, Podgy was a man who didn't take well to criticism. He took issue with the fact that he was described by witnesses as the stouter of the two. He argued with witnesses saying that he was actually a lot taller and not stout like the witnesses had originally described. Despite this, the witness repeated his testament, labelling Podgy as one of the criminals. The witness argued that the blue shirt Podgy was wearing the day of the robbery made him appear to be more stout than the shirt he was wearing that day in court, which made him look taller and slimmer. The trial went on for 3 hours. More and more evidence was brought forward, and every piece of evidence was examined thoroughly. Following this, the jury took about half an hour to convict both Podgy and Blake, and they were charged for both the Maryborough and Imbil robberies. They were lucky in some ways, however, as they did not harm their victims, as the penalty for that would have been a hanging. So the court stated, "It was a most cruel act to bind these men so that they would, in all probability, be exposed to the bush all night, and, it might be, to most serious injury, if not death. You have bound your victims with rope, and I will have you bound in return in fetters of iron. The sentence of the court is 20 years penal servitude, the first 3 years in irons." Despite this sentence, Podgy's friendly appearance appealed to a visiting justice at the Brisbane jail called A.W. Manning, who wrote a statement over 3,000 words long stating that he hoped the Gympie court judge would reconsider. This letter was passed along to the Queensland newspaper by Mr. Manning, who believed that Podgy was innocent. This caused quite a debate in the community in 1872. The other local rival newspapers such as the Queensland Times, Ipswich Herald and General Advisor contested these claims of Podgy being innocent. The other newspapers even went as far as disproving the theory by locating evidence from the trial to present to the Queensland newspaper and to Mr. Manning. After the full evidence was presented, it was agreed upon that Podgy had indeed been given a fair trial, which was backed by strong evidence. This meant there was no need to reopen the matter. So Podgy and Blake spent the next years in jail, and that is the true story of William Troden, Podgy, and Joseph Blake. This next story is one of the more memorable stories of bushrangers in the Gympie area, as it involved the robbery of a Cobb & Co coach near Gympie. This is the story of William Bond. On the 6th of January 1869, 7 gentlemen boarded the Cobb & Co coach on their way to Brisbane. Aboard the coach were notable gentlemen Mr. Selwyn King, who was a bank manager, Mr. Thomas King, a local merchant, Mr. Walker, a local miner, and Mr. Freeston of Sydney firm Freeston and Kidgel. Aboard was also a young gentleman by the name of Henry Smith, who boarded the coach merrily drunk. There were only 5 miles or about 8 kilometres from town when 2 bushrangers held up the coach. They rushed from cover onto the road about 10 yards in front of the coach. A man with a distinctively Irish accent ordered the coach driver to bail up. At the same time, another bushranger appeared from behind the coach and ordered a similar command. The bushrangers were armed with a revolver and a double-barreled gun. The coach driver felt compelled to comply with this order and stopped the coach. Unexpectedly, though, the passenger, Mr. Selwyn King, the bank manager, was also armed with an impressive Tranter revolver, and that's when things got really interesting. He did not want to surrender so easily, so he immediately fired at lead bushranger William Bond. William stumbled back for a moment as if he had been wounded by the shot before returning 3 shots back at the passengers and the coach. The first shot fired wounded the miner, Mr. Walker, and the bullet passed through his wrist. The second bullet flew through the coach cabin without harming anyone. However, it is said that the bullet came so close to Mr. Selwyn King's head that he could smell it passing by. The third bullet was later found in the frame of the coach itself. It was at this point that the passengers decided to surrender. The first to disembark the coach was Joseph Freeston, who told the bushrangers he had no involvement in the firing of the shot which hit William Bond. However, later on following this incident, Mr. Selwyn King claimed that it was actually Freeston who fired the shot, not him. Despite the blaming of one another for who fired what shots, the other passengers continued to disembark the coach. As he began to disembark, Mr. Henry Smith, the drunk gentleman, greeted the bushrangers with a smug smile and started rambling on about the inexpert shooting he had witnessed while sitting in the coach. Ignoring his ramblings, Mr. Richard Dwyer surrendered to his misfortune and without comment. Poor Mr. Walker, with his injured wrist, emerged from the coach and said, "Look here, you wretches, see what you have done," gesturing to his wrist with a big bullet hole in it. The bushrangers showed no sympathy, however, and gave him an order to stand down and pull out their pockets. The passengers willingly did so, all apart from Mr. Selwyn King, who had carefully concealed his revolver beneath the tails of his shirt. With the cash and valuables seized, the bushrangers directed the passengers to a log nearby, about 10 yards away. Then the inebriated Mr. Henry Smith rose from his seat on the log and threw his coat over his shoulder. This slight distraction was all that was needed for Mr. Selwyn King to retrieve his pistol for yet another shoot-off with the bushrangers. Mr. Selwyn King ran to a more favourable position before firing another shot, this time at William Bond's accomplice, Mr. George Palmer. The first shot evidently hit Mr. Palmer as he yelled out, "Oh, you dog!" Mr. Selwyn King fired 2 more shots to assist in his escape. He then dashed and hid in some bushes nearby. Following this, the 2 wounded and exhausted bushrangers decided that was enough excitement for one day and ordered the remaining passengers onto the coach and ordered it to drive on. The mail and other valuables in the coach were not touched, however, and the coach continued its journey towards Brisbane. Now, Mr. Selwyn King, as you may have already guessed, was not about to just forgive and forget. He met up again with the coach and the bushrangers at 7 Mile Shanty. Before long, the police were notified, and despite being wounded, the bushranging duo, Palmer and Bond, somehow managed to escape police. About a week later, though, a local police officer by the name of Matthew Colopi came across a man by the name of William Bond who was suffering from a bullet wound. He was arrested and later identified as one of the 2 bushrangers due to his distinctly Irish accent. He was then charged with 20 years in prison. As for Bond's accomplice, Mr. George Palmer, he was suspected of the crime, but there was just not enough evidence to support his involvement in the robbery. And you're probably wondering what happened to Mr. Selwyn King. Well, he was dubbed a hero by the Gympie townsfolk, officially thanked by the Queensland government, and presented with a gold watch for his bravery. This next story is about a bushranger by the name of George Palmer. This story was taken from the Winds of Change book by Ian Pedley and a Gympie Today article written in collaboration with the Gympie Family History Society from 2022. George Palmer was born around 1846 and was raised in New South Wales. Ironically, his grandfather was a magistrate who owned large portions of land and cattle in Australia, including the Ginninderra station. He moved to Queensland and married a lady by the name of Sarah Robertson in 1868. It was reported that he rode a beautiful grey thoroughbred horse by the name of Bobby, who George stole from a station in Moornish. It was said that he was an expert horseman and that the animal was an excellent jumper, which saved George from being captured by police many times. George had many brushes with the law, including his involvement with the Cobb & Co coach robbery that we just heard about. Following the Cobb & Co. coach robbery, George fled to Rockhampton. One night in Rockhampton, George galloped along the Fitzroy River trying to make a getaway from policemen who were after him for stealing horses. He dismounted from his horse and out of the view of the policemen as a ferry approached, and he led his horse on board. A man working on the ferry tried to help George and suggested that he pretend to be a ferry worker and start sweeping the floor. Then the policemen also came aboard the ferry. It was a dark night and the police thought that George must have galloped off into the bushes. They didn't expect him to be on the ferry. The policeman casually glanced over at George and wrongfully assumed him to be a ferry employee as he was sweeping the deck. The policeman even told the ferryman that they were looking for George, but the ferryman lied and said he had not seen him. Once the ferry docked, the policeman galloped off without suspicion. George wasted no time and bolted off in the opposite direction. While still in Rockhampton, he and 4 other men planned to intercept and rob gold from gold buyer Patrick Halligan. George was reported as the leader of this group, and his associates were John Williams, who was known as Old Jack, a man in his 50s, Alexander Archibald, who was a horsebreaker and horse dealer, and Charles Taylor, a man of 25, who was also a good horseman. This dealing sadly ended in the murder of Patrick Halligan for his gold. By this point, the Queensland government had offered a reward of £200 for the capture of George Palmer, and the people of Rockhampton had offered another £428 as a reward. It was said that following this, he went missing for many weeks, but it is believed that he committed more crimes between Gympie and Maryborough. He and his wife hid in the sandstone caves off Rocks Road. Thomas Steele, who was a Widgie Shire chairman, reported that George was enjoying a mug of billy tea with some passers-by when he was spotted by police officers Inspector Lloyd and Constable King from Gympie. Palmer then quickly jumped on his horse and bolted down the track towards Eel Creek, and the police were in hot pursuit. There was a large fallen tree on the track, and Palmer's horse didn't even wince and cleared the log entirely. The police's horses bogged, giving Palmer the chance to escape. Following this, Lloyd and King rode back to Thomas Abdy's homestead and asked about Palmer's hideout. They discovered that he was hiding out in the sandstone caves in the Pike Creek area. Zachariah Skyring, another Widgie Shire chairman, recalled a similar story about George Palmer. Zachariah and his father were boiling a billy when a stranger, who we now know as George Palmer, rode up and joined them. They noticed that George wore a pistol on each hip, but they did not ask him about it as they thought it was rude to ask a stranger about his personal business. A couple minutes later, George heard movement in the bushes and he swiftly jumped on his horse and took off. He heard, "Halt! Halt!" being called from the bushes, and 2 gunshots were fired. The shots had no impact on George as he galloped away, clearing a 10-foot jump across Pie Creek on his horse before retreating back to the caves. None of the police horses attempted to clear the jump, and so George got away again. Finally, on the 28th of May, 1869, he was captured in Gympie by Inspector Lloyd just across the river from Albert Park. He was ill and discouraged. Reports say he didn't even put up a fight when police caught him. The Sunday Mail reported the following regarding his crimes in Rockhampton. The murder of Halligan. We apprehend a description of Palmer as furnished by Inspector Lloyd. George Charles Fredrick Palmer, stockman, native of New South Wales, age 23, 5 feet 6 or 9, some say 10 inches high, medium or stout build, dark curly hair, short whiskers that are lately shaved, teeth project when laughing, rather good looking, scar over one of his eyes, said to have marks on the back of his hand, also an old gunshot wound in the corner of his elbow. George Palmer and Alexander Archibald were convicted of the murder of local publican and gold trader Patrick Halligan. The judge then summed up and the jury retired. After an absence of 7 minutes, they returned into court with a verdict of guilty. When asked if he had anything to say as to why a sentence should not be passed on him, Palmer murdered? No. And the judge pronounced the dreadful sentence that he was to be hanged. This took place on the 24th of November 1869 at the Rockhampton jail. This is the story of Bushranger Christian Jensen and the robbery of yet another Cobb & Co coach in Gympie. This story was taken from the Morning Bulletin newspaper article from Monday the 1st of September 1879 and also from a Gympie Times article from the 3rd of September 1879. So on Saturday the 23rd of August 1879 at around 6 a.m, a Cobb & Co coach was travelling between Gympie and Maryborough to do the mail run. There were passengers on board and a coach driver. The coach driver was called Mr. John Moorcroft, and one of the passengers was Mr. Lavoy, who was travelling from Hoffnung & Co. merchants who traded in Brisbane and Sydney. Mr. Lavoy had in his possession a large amount of valuable property, including a tin box which contained about £1,000 worth of jewellery. So they travelled for about a mile before reaching the 2 Mile Hotel. The passengers of the coach noticed that somebody had made a temporary fence across the road using some small tree saplings. The coach driver, Mr. John Moorcroft, did not think too much of this and said it was probably just a practical joke that some boys had played on him. He stopped the coach just in front of the temporary fence and saw a bushranger standing in front of the coach. The bushranger was described as a powerfully built man, and he had white calico wrapped around him which hid the lower part of his face. John, the coach driver, also noticed that the bushranger was wearing an old coat with holes in the sleeves and that the band of his hat was torn. The bushranger pointed the gun at the coach driver, Mr. Moorcroft, and ordered him to bail up and get off the coach. Mr. Moorcroft jumped down from the coach and said, "Is it mail you want?" The bushranger, Christian Jensen, said, "No, I want the box of jewellery." The bushranger then shouted at the passengers to get out of the coach. He threatened, "If you're not out by the count of 3, I'll blow your brains out. 1, 2... The passengers, Mr. Levoy and Mr. Bland, swiftly exited the coach without any further repercussions. The bushrangers then ordered them over to a tree where they were told to stay put. Christian then held the gun up to John. He said, "You hold the horses and help me with the jewellery." John offered him the cedar trunk first, but Christian said, "I want the tin box." That's when Christian took the gun from over his shoulder and put it across his arm. He held his second gun, the pistol, close to John's ear. John gave him a leather bag as well. Christian grabbed the bags and the tin box and started heading towards some nearby bushes. The box and the bags were heavy though, so Christian struggled to carry it all, stumbling and falling a few times on his way to the bushes. The passengers took this distraction as an opportunity to escape, and they ran as fast as they could back to Gympie. After this, in the distance, John witnessed Christian hitting the box with something, obviously trying to break it open. Once Christian had disappeared into the scrub, John remounted the coach and drove back to Gympie to report the robbery to police. Sergeant Walsh, along with 4 or 5 other constables on horses, returned to the site where the robbery took place. Mr. Lavoy, one of the coach passengers, described to the police officers how difficult it was for Christian to escape the loot, considering how heavy it was. He suggested that perhaps Christian could have dumped the loot in some nearby bushes. The police then put up a reward for anyone who could locate the stolen goods or anything else linked to the robbery in the bushes nearby. A miner by the name of Tom Jones took up the police on their offer, and he was quickly rewarded when he found Christian's gun and pistol along with a white blanket that belonged to him. It was understood that the blanket was probably used by Christian to carry his loot. Jones was also lucky enough to stumble upon the tin of jewellery. The outside of the tin had been battered, but it remained unopened. The box was then brought into town, and when it arrived on Commissioner's Hill, a hearty cheer was heard. Mr. Lavoy then opened the box and found that none of the jewellery had been removed. Upon examining the firearms, Sergeant Walsh recognised the pistol, and from the information he had received, he believed it belonged to a man with the last name Jensen, who matched the description of the robber described by the passengers. The pistol was borrowed by Christian from a man named Robinson, who was a local gunsmith. Following this robbery, Christian apparently approached Robinson and told him that he had lost the pistol, but told Robinson to not talk about its disappearance, which is not suspicious at all. The second gun turned out to be the property of Mr. Wise, who was Christian's brother-in-law. Christian was described as a young man, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with fair complexion and light hair. His neighbours described him as not having a good character. However, many forgave him as they were under the impression that he was, quote, deficient in intellect. It was even described that not long after the robbery, he threatened some of his relatives with a knife. His usual occupation when he wasn't bushranging was a miner. The Morning Bulletin described the act in itself, in its conception, is by no manner of means the idea of a madman. Christian Jensen stood for trial in Maryborough Courthouse on Wednesday the 5th of May 1880 for his involvement in the Cobb & Co. coach robbery. Christian's lawyer, Mr. F.B. Sheridan, unsuccessfully pleaded that his client was not guilty on the grounds that his client was mentally insane. However, Christian Jensen was found guilty by the court and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. This next true story is about how 5 armed bushrangers committed a robbery at the Curra Hotel, which in 1868 was also known as Curry. So at about 7 p.m. on the 19th of April 1868, Mr. White, who was a bank manager, and Mr. Buckland, who was also a bank manager of a new branch in Gympie, were seated on the sofa having a glass of wine together at the Curry Hotel when they heard a scream. A masked bushranger burst in the hotel with a large revolver in his hand. He ordered the 2 men to bail up. Mr. White took off his coat and had a large revolver attached to his belt. Mr. White grabbed his revolver and the bushranger noticed this and immediately presented a revolver to his head. Mr. White grabbed the bushranger's wrist and directed the revolver towards his stomach. He pulled the trigger 3 times, but the revolver did not fire. The revolver was not one that he usually carried, and he did not notice that the safety guard was on, which was why the gun did not fire. Having the bushranger held down, Mr. White could not let him go to undo the safety, so instead he pushed the bushranger back towards the door and started hitting his head with a barrel. Meanwhile, the other 4 bushrangers were inside the hotel looking for money and valuables. The first bushranger screamed out for help, and so the other 2 bushrangers came to his rescue, each holding a revolver to Mr. White's head. Seeing he was now outnumbered, Mr. White dropped his pistol and said, "There are my arms, take them." The bushrangers lowered their arms for a brief moment before, bam! Mr. White pulled out yet another revolver, which he had concealed. He fired the second revolver at the first bushranger's stomach. The man fell down but got back up again when the other bushrangers ordered him to fire the double-barrel gun at Mr. White. The bushranger fired the double-barrel gun at Mr. White from about 6 yards or 5.4 meters away. While it was never fully confirmed, reports claim it was more than likely that Mr. White escaped being hit as it was dark outside the hotel at this point. Mr. White then fired a shot in return to the bushrangers, but missed. Mr. White had only 2 bullets left, so he thought it was a good idea to leave. He dashed into some nearby bushes and hid not too far from the hotel. Mr. and Mrs. Booker, who were the owners of the hotel, were still inside the hotel and were at the mercy of the bushrangers. The bushrangers searched high and low for valuables, but they only found about 15 pounds and took with them a bottle of brandy and plum pudding. After realising there were next to no items of value left to steal, the 5 bushrangers fled the scene. The bushrangers all wore masks, and it was said that they were perhaps following Mr. White, who had only just returned from the gold diggings hours before this incident occurred. The assumption was that Mr. White would be carrying a large amount of money and gold with him. It was to their disappointment that Mr. White had little money on him when they confronted him at the Curry Hotel. There are no records of the 5 bushrangers ever being identified or charged following this robbery. Now we will learn about some other notorious bushrangers who lived in Queensland. This next true story is about a robbery committed by a bushranger who went by the name of James Alpin Mcpherson, also known as the Wild Scotchman. This story came from the Queensland newspaper article on the 22nd of September 1866. So on the 27th of November 1865, a postman by the name of John Hickey was carrying mail from Gayndah when he was robbed by the Wild Scotchman. He recounts, "I got the mail bags from the Gayndah post office between 7 and 8 o'clock. When I got about 26 miles on the road near Mr. Irwin's public house, a man rode up to me and presented a revolver at me. 'The prisoner is the man,' he said. 'Pull off the road. I want to see if there is a letter in the bag for the Wild Scotchman.' I went off the road about 200 yards when he told me to take the bags off. I did so, when the prisoner opened the large bag and took out the letters, opened them, and then took the money and checks out. He gave me some checks back and kept some. The prisoner was kneeling on one knee with his revolver close to him and his gun behind him. I collected the letters he left and put them in the bag. The prisoner left and I went on to the Golden Fleece and telegraphed to the police. I saw the prisoner again the next day, about 4.5 miles on the Gayndah side of Mr. Irwin's house. He was arrested. I was carrying the mail by then." On the 13th of September 1866, almost a year later, during his court trial, the Wild Scotchman was charged for the robbery near Gayndah. He made no defence beyond saying that the gun found on him was a common fowling piece which every traveller in the bush carried, and that the 2 pistols were only small pocket pistols which it was common for bushmen to carry. During this trial, he was also charged with the second robbery, which took place on the 28th of November 1865, the day after the first robbery had occurred. This second robbery was of similar nature to the first, with the Wild Scotchman stealing mail from the mailman on the Gayndah to Maryborough mail run. The Wild Scotchman begged the jury to reflect on the evidence and give him the benefit of the doubt if they had any. However, despite this, the jury found the Wild Scotchman guilty of all charges. The Chief of Justice stated that he could not see anything in either cases that would allow him to pass a light sentence. He said that the Wild Scotchman had entered upon the most dangerous course, one affecting vitally the welfare and prosperity of this country, and had committed an offence which called for a severe example. The Wild Scotchman was then sentenced to 25 years in prison. This next story is the story of Fredrick Ward, a bushranger who went by the name of Captain Thunderbolt. Fredrick Ward was born near Wilberforce in New South Wales around 1834. He was the youngest child of 11 children. His father was an ex-convict and his mother was a free settler. He spent his youth developing his bush survival skills and horsemanship, working at many well-known stations in the area. In 1856, Fred was spotted helping his nephew to steal horses from the Tokel station from which he worked. It was widely known that he and his nephew had an arrangement in which they would use local auctioneers to sell these stolen horses and cattle. Both men were caught and sentenced to 10 years of labour on Cockatoo Island. After just 4 years, though, he got himself a ticket of leave, which meant he could work in the Mudgee area instead. In saying this, Ward became impatient and decided to escape. On the 11th of September 1863, Ward and another inmate by the name of Fredrick Britton successfully escaped. Both men started committing robberies in the New England area. One day, the bushrangers were spotted by police officers near what is now known as the Big Rock in Uralla, which is known also as Thunderbolt's Rock, due to this being his hideout. In this encounter, Ward was shot in the back of the knee by officers, yet despite this, he still managed to escape authorities. Following this, Ward and Britton went their separate ways. This was around the time when he started going by the name of Captain Thunderbolt. One story describes that Ward robbed a toll keeper at his house one night. He reported that the way that he bashed on his front door sounded like thunder. When he opened the door, Wood stood there, pistol in hand, and said, "I'm the thunder and this is my bolt," hence the name Thunderbolt. In a bid to escape the police attention in New South Wales, Thunderbolt then fled to Queensland. There were even reports that he had an altercation with a Ballarat miner who was returning home from the gold diggings in Gympie in 1868. Both gentlemen were armed, but apparently no injuries came of it. It was in Ipswich, though, in 1870, however, that Police Sergeant William Francis developed a keen interest in the capture of Captain Thunderbolt. This interest came about because Sergeant William owned a station in Warwick before he was a police officer. In his time as a station owner, Captain Thunderbolt paid his station a visit. It was on Tuesday the 8th of February 1870 in Ipswich, though, that Sergeant William Francis finally captured Captain Thunderbolt. When word got around town that the notorious Captain Thunderbolt had been arrested in Ipswich, the town people were all anxious to capture a glimpse of him in court. Many witnesses were brought up from New South Wales to help identify him. However, all witnesses could not without a doubt identify him as the man who had committed the robberies in New South Wales. Sergeant Francis called for other police witnesses from New South Wales to attend his court trial in Ipswich, but they were too late. The magistrate had released Captain Thunderbolt on account that he had lied and said his name was Joseph Leach. The magistrate could not find anyone by the name of Joseph Leach or any crimes committed by a Joseph Leach, so the magistrate let him go. Captain Thunderbolt then fled back to New South Wales. It was there where he committed several more robberies, including mail robberies in New England. It all came to an end, however, on the 25th of May, 1870, when he was spotted near Uralla by two police officers. The police officers had received reports of a robbery in the area. Captain Thunderbolt was involved in a gunfight pursuit with the two officers, which lasted well over an hour. Captain Thunderbolt was then shot by the police officer Alex Walker in a nearby stream as he was trying to escape on foot. It was in this stream that Captain Thunderbolt passed away. And that brings us to the end of the Bushrangers presentation today. Are you interested in learning more? Please check out our local history blog called Gympie Regional Memories. Each month, the local history officer adds new local history posts, including posts about bushrangers. Or why not drop in and visit our local history room here at the Gympie Library? We are open Monday to Thursday and alternate Fridays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Come in and use our new public research PC to research your family history or maybe even your house history. We also have the Gympie Times on microfilm dating back to 1868. It's a wonderful space, so please come in and say hello. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Bushrangers presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it, and please check out our library website for even more resources on our local bushrangers. Thank you, and I hope you have a nice day.